Part 2, read by Matthew Anson. Chapter 4. Psst! Christmas! He heard his name being called. He had convinced himself that it was only in his head. He shrugged off the sound. Psst!
Out!
Christmas woke from a sleepy daze, shaking his foot. Frank had stamped his heel into his toe. There's a knife. My front pocket.
And?
Christmas mumbled lazily. Get it, you Bible basher. We're tied to a tree. Knife's got rope. Remember? Christmas shaped his mouth to respond, but found he was speechless. In his sleep, he had forgotten the reasons why his neck felt heavy and his hands motionless, and why his back felt damp and itchy. How could he have?
I know what a knife can do.
Remembering the scar that marked his stomach, Frank kicked him.
Stop it! Stop kicking me!
Stop shouting or they'll hear us. Get the bloody knife. Christmas took a deep breath. He needed to calm his nerves, and he needed to calm his temper. This was not time to get agitated. He needed to think straight and focus.
Okay, where is it?
Right pocket,
Great.
Christmas thought. From his right eye, Frank would be completely blind to him. He wriggled his shoulders to loosen his hands. The ropes burnt his wrists, but they had been tied carelessly. Within moments, he managed to get a hand free from behind his back. With his arm outstretched towards what he could guess was Frank's pocket, he began to search for the knife. The cold metal suddenly caught his fingers, and he trapped the handle in his grasp. Slowly, he removed it. His fingers became clumsy, and he dropped the knife. It hit the ground with a dull thunk. Nice one, Christmas. Nice one.
Give me a moment.
Awkwardly, he tried to get the knife with his boots, his left eye shaping it before him. He dragged it towards the tree. The knife came into contact with it. Christmas repositioned himself as best he could to push the knife up the wood with his feet. A couple of attempts later, he managed to grasp it within his hands. He flicked the blade out, a cheap penknife, and began sawing away at the rope that bound his other hand tightly.
Would you like your knife back?
Just uncut me, for the love of God.
You need to watch your tongue.
Christmas proceeded to cut through Frank's bindings. It took a few moments as the Indians perceived him a bigger threat for some reason, and made sure he was tied tighter. Rubbing his wrists, Frank grumbled a thank you before yanking the blade from Christmas's grasp and pocketing the tool.
Took you long enough.
Christmas turned to see Antistia with her arms crossed and an amused expression on her face. Marcus stood just behind her, smirking.
How did you get free, my lady?
Christmas inquired.
Well, while you two were busy arguing, I realised I still had my knife, so I cut us both free. Simple.
Why didn't you come and help us then? Frank retorted.
Because it was funny to watch.
Antistia giggled. Hang on. You say you had a knife? Where?
Strapped to my thigh. Where else?
A knife? Never mind. We need to move on. Frank stormed ahead of the others. He was starting to think that he should have left when he had the chance. He did not know where he was leading them. Should he go ahead and confront the Indians, or avoid them? His questions were answered when he saw a flickering light in the distance. He held up to silence the rabble. Crouching low in the grass, he began to move cautiously towards the light. It was the Indian camp. Around were at least 20 of them. It varied from the elderly, children, and what seemed to be the warriors of the tribe. The chief was sat away from the rest of the group. His head rested in his hand, and a young woman kneeled beside him, tending to a wound on his arm. Frank instinctively reached for his pocket for the gun, but he found it missing. He cursed under his breath and drew the knife once more. Frank looked over his shoulder to see Anchor stumble slightly as he tried to lower himself to the ground. He tried to hiss to the pirate to back off, but Anchor ignored him and tried to crouch down. And before Frank could say or do anything, Mark fell and crashed to the ground, alerting the Indians to their presence. Mark had followed the three of them, sighing as he saw all of them squat to hide in the grass. At his height, it was not something he had done often. He would go headlong and fight the enemy, rather than sneak up on them. The idea itself was preposterous. The Indian seemed to have taken his anchor. It did not feel right. He felt oddly unbalanced. and that was when he fell. A commotion roared from the camp as the Indians grabbed their weapons and stormed to where the four of them were concealed. They surrounded them, blades and guns pointing to their heads. The chief followed them into the grass. When he saw them, his tired expression changed to that of a rather confused one.
"How did you escape?"
The chief said. "Listen, there's been a huge," Frank blurted.
"Americans. Kill them!"
"Calm yourself one moment, chieftain. I know not of what quarrel ye have with Frankie here. However, if ye be wishing for a fight, then you shan't be leaving here unharmed,"
Mark said, staring the man dead in the eyes. Mark wondered for a while who these Americans were, a civilization that he hadn't heard of before. Peculiar. The chieftain's expression softened, perhaps because of his nationality. Britain had always accommodated natives of the New World, and even forged good relations with some of the tribes. Mark hoped this one could be negotiated with, maybe with Frank as the exchange.
We are not Americans.
Christmas winked at Frank.
"But he is."
The chief replied, glancing at Frank.
"It's been a pleasure making your acquaintance, Frankie. But it would seem we be parting
Antistia slapped him on the shoulder.
Don't you dare, Marcus. He saved my life before. We will not let him die.
She turned to face the chief.
This is not the way to settle this. We are no threat to you. We are simply lost. There is no need to be afraid of Frank. He's one of us.
The chief had listened attentively to Antistia. He sighed, holding his head in his hands.
"Bring them all to the camp."
A couple of teepees marked a small clearing enclosed by trees. Dull yellow buffalo skins were stretched over a skeletal framework of branches. The tents were not as numerous as Mike expected. Around the campfire sat 20 or so people, and 4 were laid out on the ground, their limbs bound in bandages. The ratio of Native Americans to teepees was completely off. Mark wondered why, but then bandages told another story. The strong smell of pine pinched at his nose, and the heat of the fire warmed his cold cheeks. The wisp of some Indian pipes lifted with the smoke of the fire and ascended like fog. It stung his eyes. Mark had quickly struck a conversation with a chieftain, who spoke surprisingly good English. The chieftain was an avid talker, but deftly avoided giving any meaningful conversation, unwilling to divulge any information. Mark took great amusement from the hospitality, especially as he, Tia, and Christmas were sat around a fire. Frank was tied to a nearby tree. His head lolled from side to side unconsciously. Maybe he'd wake up soon. That would be fun. So far, the conversation had yielded some results. The chieftain's name was Black Cattle, and his tribe would have sought to wave. After asking about the injuries, the chieftain seemed to open up a little. They'd come under attack by an American force, their army sweeping across their camp and slaughtering men, women, and children mercilessly. Those who had fled had aimed for the trees and quickly escaped.
"It was a bloodbath. American swine descended on us. We stood no chance."
"Well, then, it be no wonder ye dislike the cur behind us,"
Mark replied.
"What path do you follow? Your company are unusual and strange."
"No path in particular. That be our heading. We are but strangers to one another. Perhaps we shall return home. Myself, I just want me ship back, that I might sail the seas once more as a free man."
"Why do you side with the white American scum?"
"His company be not of my choosing. Mistress Tia over there be wishing for it. She be indebted to dear old Frankie."
"Hey! What the hell?" Frank interrupted. His angry face looked bruised and weary as he fought against the rope.
"My apologies, Frankie, but these gentlemen of finery have only parleyed with us decent folk. You might care to know that the buffalo they offer is a mighty fine specimen of food. Oh, how rude of this humble pirate! Would ye care for a piece?"
"Untie me! Now!"
"What be your opinion, chieftain? He not be with the men who attacked you, but your decision it be."
I trust him.
Christmas offered, finishing the mouthful of meat.
You can trust us, great Chief Black Kettle.
Letitia added sincerely.
"Prove it."
Chapter 5. Atistia found it hard to believe the heat that burnt her, considering how cold she had been the night before. Her thin stola had been barely enough to protect her as she slept, but now it clung to the sweat off her back. The hot saddle irritated her sore legs as she rode, her arms wrapped around Christmas's waist, as he steered the horse towards the town. Marcus and Frank rode separately on either side. Her head was rested on Christmas's back, drowsy with sleepiness. She suffered the same recurring dream every time she closed her eyes.
What is it that you dream?
She heard Christmas say.
Home?
She whispered.
Do you miss it?
It's gone.
She said, choking back a tear. The others looked suddenly over.
My home was Pompeii.
Atistia uttered. Then they all knew. The horses trudged on, their hooves scraping against the hard ground and snorting out the sand that trickled at their noses. The sand rose from the ground, carried in the warm breeze, and scratched Antistia's skin. Her eyes stung from the unrelenting heat, and her lips cracked. It felt as if they had been travelling for days. She knew they had left a first glimpse of the sun, and now it was far on its journey across the sky. Before them, the golden land seemed never-ending, with no sign of shade.
Not long now.
Christmas's voice broke through Antistia's thoughts.
I can see it up ahead.
He squeezed her hand. Antistia peered around his shoulder, and there, in the distance, she could make out a town, floating in a haze. They continued to ride, getting ever closer. A tower loomed overhead, sheltering them from the rays of the sun.
Could this be the building the chief had asked them to destroy?
Atistia thought. The task seemed impossible. They were in open plains. There was no conceivable way they could remain hidden. As they arrived at the gates of the tower, a figure emerged from the shadows. He looked no older than 18, yet he carried the air of a senator, a man who would rather gorge on the fruits of his empire than to fight for it. His uniform seemed too long for his stout figure, his trouser legs dragging around his ankles, and his brown hair flopped over his eyes. Wiping his hair aside, he glared up at the four strangers.
"State your name and business,"
the young soldier asked. Antistia turned to Frank, expecting him to answer, but something had stopped him.
We are simply weary travellers in need of food and water. Will you let us pass?
She started, batting her eyelids.
We've been travelling for days in this ghastly heat. I don't know how much longer we can go on.
Antistia lied, her voice softening to encourage her story. Yet the soldier seemed unmoved, clearly unimpressed that a woman had answered him.
"Excuse me?"
He chuckled.
Please, sir. We just need some supplies.
Christmas attempted.
"And who might you be?"
The soldier smirked.
I'm a pastor.
Unlike any character I've seen in these parts, you keep unusual friends, sir. She needs to hold her tongue.
He grunted, nodding towards Antistia.
And he
The soldier continued, pointing at Marcus.
he looks ridiculous. Well, go on, holy man, in you go."
He stepped back of the horse and they bolted into the streets of the town.
What a rude gentleman!
Antistia announced.
"Aye, a most unpleasant sort of man."
Mark replied. Either way, we've forgotten how sorely we stick out. We need a change, Frankie added. Mark didn't like Frank's idea very much. He was fond of his clothing, and had never felt under pressure to change. Fashion was no concern of his. We'll go to the general store. There should be something in there. Otherwise, we may need to find a tailor, Frank continued. The four of them made their way down a foreign street, passing the bank, jailhouse, and undertakers. At the end of the road stood the church, and to its left was the general store. There, they dismounted and hitched their horses to a nearby post. Inside the store held an assortment of goods and various items of clothing, including a rack of hats, which Frankie practically dived for. Oh, sweet, sweet hats! What a beautiful Stetson! Frankie beamed. cautiously placing each different hat on his head and admiring their look. Christmas moved off to browse through the shoes, whilst Tia approached the clothing with a somewhat bewildered expression. Curiously, she held up each gown to compare to her tattered stola. Mark didn't want to comprehend how long this would take. An hour or so later, they entered a nearby saloon. Tia rustic, yet elegant, in her new cream dress, patterned with blue flowers, her brown jacket, leather boots, and suede hat. She smiled, as if proud of herself. Frankie had gotten a dark brown Stetson, and both Christmas and Mark had elected to remain the same. Mark knew he would feel insecure, and he was not afraid of what people would think. Silence greeted them for a moment as they walked into the saloon, and took one of the corner tables. The eyes were drawn to the unexpected presence of a woman. Only one other was there, mopping behind the bar. "So, what now?" Frankie asked.
"We'll be needing to pry information out of these drunken fools, but our efforts will be for naught if we can't blend in. I'll grab some rum and join that gaming table over there,"
Mark said, gesturing over at the gamble table that had immediately caught his attention.
Wait a moment, is that the best way to go about this? Gambling always ends badly.
Christmas said.
"You be talking to one who thrives on lucky chances."
Mark moved off to the bar, hoping they served a good bottle of much-needed rum. Christmas leaned back in his chair. He was not in favour of gambling, and was not impressed that Anticia had already been served free drinks. She was taking them gladly, swallowing down the poison as though it were water. They were all still dehydrated from the tray. Christmas had no objections to a glass of wine. He rather enjoyed slouching into the sofa with Kath, holding a full glass in one hand. However, Anticia's naive innocence saddened him. How could she know the advantage these strangers were taking? If she could see it from his perspective, he knew her ladylike manners would never approve of her current conduct. Christmas's chair creaked as he stood to his feet and headed towards the bar.
"Oh, Christmas, you have to taste this sweet, sweet, nice juice."
Anticia blared into his face. Her breath smelt and a coat wafted cigar smoke.
I know what it tastes like, and I think you've had enough, lovely. Come now, let's sit down.
Christmas attempted to usher her away, but she resisted and stumbled forward. He tried to catch her, but she moved away, giggling as if they had played a game. Tag had never been Christmas's idea of a fun game. He followed as Anticia continued to run around, her loud giggles filling the space until they suddenly transposed into hiccups. Christmas watched the childish surprise that spread on Anticia's face at the unusual sound that seemed to bounce from her chest. He could not help but smile. The hiccuping was drawing unwanted laughs. Christmas approached Anticia again, but still she motioned away. This time she was completely unbalanced and fell face first onto the gambling table. The chips scattered to the floor and the drinks dribbled down the table legs. Anticia made no effort to get up again.
"Perhaps this lass has had one too many,"
Mark chuckled, amused at the undignified limp body laid out in front of him, her red hair soaking up his spilt rum.
Yes, and I think rest would be the best option, don't you?
Christmas suggested. Mark nodded to him in response. Christmas felt a sigh of relief as Mark gathered Anticia into his arms, her head hanging over his forearm, and walked her up the narrow staircase. A sound sleep would do her good. It was barely afternoon, but at least the heat of the day was fading. Christmas rubbed his missing eye and asked for a glass of water. He scanned the room. The commotion of the previous minutes had vanished. The gamblers were reabsorbed in their game with every chip replaced. The barmaid was busy dabbing at the puddles of alcohol and collected glasses onto a wooden tray. Christmas turned his head to see the other side of the room. That was where Frank sat, alone, his hand clutching an empty glass, and his eyes transfixed by a spot on the table. Finishing his last mouthful of water, Christmas bent over. The light was lower and cast shadows on Frank's face. His eyes seemed blacker and liquid like oil. Christmas knew it would be risky to interrupt. Frank was obviously hot-headed and had made it quite clear that he disliked company, but he chose to sit down anyway. It was not anger you could see in Frank's face, but it was pain.
Do you miss home? Pretty strange here.
Christmas said. Frank didn't respond.
I miss home. All the mountains, the sea, the snow. I miss my wife, Kat. Beautiful woman she is.
Frank grunted.
You got a family? Wife? Kids, maybe?
Christmas asked, to which Frankie slammed his glass into the wall. That's none of your business. Silence dawned in the saloon, everyone turning to stare at Frankie, assessing whether he was a threat. Within a few minutes, chatter started up again, and they were ignored once more.
Sorry,
Christmas attempted.
I didn't mean to pry.
Frankie sighed. Not your fault.
Difficult subject? I understand.
You understand. You understand, do you? You know what it feels like to have your wife never recognize you? You know what it feels like to lose your child before you even know them? To be betrayed by someone you trusted fully, only to end up in this damn place? Don't pretend you know what it feels like, Christmas. You're a fool if you think you do. Christmas twiddled his thumbs and chewed his lip nervously.
You're right. I am a fool, and I don't understand. But I know how it feels to be alienated by the ones you love. I know how it feels to be betrayed by your friends and abandoned in a ditch.
Christmas paused and pressed the soft flesh of his stolen eye. What happened to your eye?
A 17-year-old boy isn't much of a match for 5 men and their rods. Why, it was a small sacrifice to survive the state I was in. I would have been in a hellhole the rest of my life if it hadn't been for God.
I'm sorry. I didn't know. Frankie reached into his pocket and retrieved his flask, taking a few large gulps of burning alcohol. I don't see how God has ever helped me, though. Why would he send me here? I'd rather die now anyway than be stuck here forever.
I can see why you would think that. But what if we were brought here for something? God values your life, Frank.
Obviously not highly. Well, nothing will come good in my life again. Nothing will give my life meaning again. Not since Willie. Frankie looked down at the table, his gaze becoming distant.
All I wanted was for life to mean something. Why I had to suffer, why I still held wounds from the knife my father carried. God was my true father, and he has loved me and given me Kat.
I imagine Kath is your wife then.
Yes. Who is William?
My son. Was my son. I never saw him. Stillbirth.
Oh, I wish I could help.
Christmas said. Frankie merely shrugged. I'm gonna grab another drink, Frankie said, walking off towards the bar. Chapter 6. Anticia tilted her hat forward to cover her eyes from the glare of the sun. It was as if it burnt through her skull, melting all that it held. It hurt, and however much she tried to remember why, she could not. She had awoken from sleep under a white ceiling and tucked into pink floral covers. She was fully dressed, with a hat placed on the table by the bed. When she tried to sit up, her head felt as though it was too heavy to lift up from the comfort of the pillow. She could hear the others outside the door. They had been arguing about who would be the one to wake her up. Frank's voice was the loudest. I'm not waking her up. You can do that, Christmas. His voice had pierced straight through her. Grabbing her hat, Anticia managed to pull herself out of the bed and to the door. Slowly, pushing down the handle, she opened the door to see them huddled outside.
Please keep your voices down,
she whispered. The 3 men chuckled, masking their laughs with their fists.
I hate you. This is not funny.
So, you got rid of your hiccups? Frank asked jokingly.
Hiccups?
Does not matter. We need to go now. Now they were crouched by the side of the building, the sun already hot in their faces, although only an hour had passed since it had dawned. Anticia envied Marcus, who was stood on the other side of the tower, hidden in the shade. Meanwhile, Frankie was dashing around her, scouting the building, searching for the best place to set the tower alight. He stopped by a gap in the woodwork, where 2 planks had fallen away, and reached into his pocket, removing 2 small slates of flint. he whispered to Christmas, who wasn't far behind. Letitia giggled at Marcus's disapproving glare. He had not consented to the use of rum. Letitia, go get the horses. She waited and watched as Christmas crept up to the tower and started to pour out the rum and swiftly moved to go fetch the horses. Outside the general store, Letitia checked over the sandy saddles and started to untie the ropes from the post, gathering the reins in a bundle in her hands. She began to guide them over to the tower. She saw Christmas throw the last of rum, including the bottle, into the mound of hay, and Frankie went forward to spark a flame with the flint. A small sparkle caught on the hay, rapidly igniting into flames. The glass bottle shattered, and Christmas retreated back, covering his face with his arm. The roaring fire seized the tower. Letitia turned away. She could not look. But it was no use. The heat, the smell, the sound of it, it was all the same as her dreams. She tightened her grip on the reins and stroked her fingers down the nose of the horse that stood beside her. The horse fidgeted, obviously unnerved. Letitia could feel the hot breath on her skin.
Shh, it'll be alright. Calm down.
Letitia whispered to the horse, trying to calm herself at the same time. His tail was still swishing nervously, but his head rested in her hands. Frank came over, seeming pleased with his handiwork, followed by Marcus and Christmas. Letitia suddenly heard a slamming of doors and the shouts of men. The town was awake. Looking down the street, she could see a crowd forming.
Christmas, look over there. We need to go now.
Letitia leapt onto the horse. Christmas nodded in reply, and he and Marcus mounted the other two horses.
Frank, are you joining us or not?
Only if I can drive, Frank replied, giving Letitia a stern look as she rode up to him in front of the saddle.
Just get on the horse, Frankie. We do not have time for this now.
Fine, Frank reluctantly agreed. Offering him her arm, Letitia helped him hoist him onto the horse. The three horses cantered down to the desert, an orange glow still lifting in the distance. The guard watched the flames rise high above the buildings. Soldiers gathered around the streets, marching towards the disturbance. The guard followed, gazing up at the billowing smoke in the morning breeze. He recognized the burning building to be the town's watchtower. At the main gates were 3 horses tearing out the town. The guard ran to the gate to watch where they rode. A mass of people, mostly on horseback, stood awaiting them in the distance. The guard realized that they were a group of Native Americans, outlawed from crossing these town borders, and liked to be stragglers from the incidents at Sand Creek. As the 3 horses joined the gathering, they began to move with speed to the west, the left of the town. The guard realized the burning of a watchtower had been a distraction. The Indians obviously needed to pass unscathed. He would not let them. Rushing into the chaos surrounding the flames, he located his captain and explained the situation, showing him the retreating Indians. Within minutes, he began organizing troops and was busy sending scouts to neighboring towns for more men. They were to pursue the natives in the morning. They would make them pay the price.
Jimmy, what's going on here?
Jimmy turned to see a young soldier standing there, only just nearing his 18th birthday, yet wearing a red uniform ready to fight. Jimmy gripped his friend's shoulder and grinned savagely. We're about to go hunt and rob. So, without the knowledge of Frank, 2 major influences of his future life were about to enter the fray. Jimmy, the man who would betray Frank to his near death in 1918, and Robert Douglas, Frank's father. Letitia's mind wandered. It had only been a few days, yet it felt like a lifetime. To the point her old life seemed more like a dream. However, the more she thought about it, the more that dream came back, and it felt no easier to know the truth. To know that her home and her family had gone. To know that the last words she had ever said to her mother were in a fight over a blonde wig. Wiping her eyes quickly on her sleeve, she looked up the expanse before her, and could see ahead the temporary camp the Indians had made. They were nearly at the meeting point. They're following us! Frank's shouting burst from Anticia's sigh of relief at thinking they were nearly safe. Can't we go any faster? Frank asked her hurriedly.
Yes, but you might fall off. The horses might not manage it anyway. We've pushed them too hard already. We are nearly there.
We'll have to push them more.
Fine, but it's on your head, Frank. Hold on.
She shouted back at him as she brought their horse up to a gallop. Marcus and Christmas were not far behind, and immediately kicked their heels into the horse's sides to pick up speed. They rushed into the camp, Frankie jumping off the horse and running to talk to the chief. Marcus and Christmas went after him. Instead of going with them, Anticia led the horses over to the nearest bit of shade and started to remove their saddles. She had always loved horses, and tending to them here brought back happy memories of when she had played games in the stables as a child with Aurelius and her brothers. Anticia removed the last saddle and placed it on the ground. She noticed Christmas suddenly approach her.
You ride well. However, I don't think Frankie was too pleased.
He said with a grin.
There is more to a person than meets the eye. You shouldn't underestimate me. None of you should. I can look after myself.
I did not quite mean that.
Christmas answered, but Anticia looked sceptically.
Any news?
Frankie and the chief think you should go back to the main camp to meet the women and children. They thought that I should be the one to tell you.
No, I am not going. I am fighting.
I thought you would disagree. Mark refused to comment.
There's no time anyway.
Christmas seemed to pause and thought.
Come on, let's find the others.
Mark had been forced to speaking to the chief, whilst Christmas went to give the message to Antistia. In the meantime, he had to look over maps of nearby areas. Scouts had reported the American army was on its way. It would arrive tomorrow afternoon. The chief had put forward a plan to draw them to the plains, using the rocks as an active cover, to hide their warriors in the trees and surprise them that way. Mark had shot down that idea.
Flanking manoeuvre won't help you, Chief. The correct manner of fighting we can expect to see would be for them to set up on the highest hill and form firing lines.
Mark stated.
We'll be lucky if they have less than a dozen cannon.
So, what do you suggest? Frankie asked.
We hide behind the rocks and wait for their main force to approach. We keep the bulk of the main force back to lure them in. Once we spring the ambush and disrupt their formations, we can charge with the main force.
What of their cannons?
The chief asked.
We can only bear them. We will come under fire, and though it not be my intention to be blown to smithereens, we can only hope for minimal casualties.
And what will you be doing? Will you join us in battle?
The chief asked, motioning to both Frankie and Mark.
This is not your fight.
I'm not one for running from a fight. I'll be with the main force. Frankie, will you join me?
Mark said. I'll help. But what of Christmas and Antistia?
The choice be down to them, though I doubt the holy man will be joining us for this foray.
As if on cue, Christmas and Antistia rounded one of the nearby tents and approached them. Frankie brought them up to speed of the situation.
I will attend the wounded,
Christmas said, casting anxious glances towards Antistia.
And what of Miss Tia?
Mark asked.
I'll fight by your side, for honour.
There may be no coming back from this fight. Are you sure of your decision?
Antistia glared at him with the ferociousness of a lioness.
I refuse to allow my friends to go forth and fight without me.
Mark smirked at her.
What now?
You'll get some rest. Tomorrow will be one hell of a day, Frankie replied. The following day, the camp was demolished, weapons were sharpened, and horses were fed. Reports of the army and local populace claimed they were only an hour or so away. The Indians had set up the ambushing troops behind the rocks. They had waited there patiently for at least 2 hours, unmoving. Meanwhile, Frankie, Tia, and Mark waited for the main force, waiting for the enemy to rise over the crest of the hill. Christmas had left them there after blessing them each in turn. He had proceeded to move off towards one of the taller hills to observe the battle to come. Some time later, clouds blanketed the sky, casting shadows across the land. The stamping of feet became audible. The shaking in the ground increased as an army appeared over the hill. Men in horseback at the fore, infantry following, and at rear, cannons. So they're here, Frankie said.
They'll set up their cannons and fire at us from a distance. It's unlikely they'll move their infantry into position until they've reduced our numbers.
Mark replied. What's to stop a cannibal killing us?
Well, let's just hope the Holy Man's blessing is worth more than my spit.
Have faith, Marcus.
Tia interjected. The cannons were set up and loaded within minutes. The Indian force just had to stay put, waiting for the exploding balls of iron to rain upon them. The infantry lines stayed behind the gun batteries. The ambush force stayed behind their rocks. A series of bangs erupted as the gunpowder exploded, hurling shot across the battlefield. It pummeled into the Indian ranks, killing dozens on impact.
Spread out! Give them less of a target to hit!
Mark shouted. They just had to bear one more volley before they could retreat, otherwise the enemy generals might suspect a ruse. The second volley.
All hands retreat!
Everyone ran as fast as they could, looking back every so often to watch for incoming shots in the hope of dodging them. Tia, Frankie, and Mark stayed together as much as possible. A stampede of allies throwing them left and right. When are they gonna follow us, Mark? Frankie asked.
Soon, I hope.
Frankie's heart beat in his head. He cast a glance towards the American lines to see the men weren't moving yet. They'd be out of cannon range soon. The Americans had to chase them or they'd lose them. A man on horseback at the top of the hill seemed to trot forwards a little. Someone shouted at him. Who was he? He clearly wasn't a high-ranking officer. Suddenly he broke formation and charged forwards. The infantry followed him, and the guns fell silent. What's happening? Frankie asked.
I not be sure. It appears someone disobeyed orders. Christmas's blessing was worth something after all.
Mark replied. We just have to keep running a little longer then. The man on horseback slowed down and waited for his troops to catch up with him. They approached the first set of rocks where the Indians were hiding. A few moments more. A great war cry went up from the hidden troops as they leapt from their hidden place and descended onto the unexpecting men.
Charge!
Mark said, and the chief's war cry drowned out the sound of all else. A great surge of energy struck Frankie as he ran as fast as possible towards the Americans. Bullets whistled through the air. A few men were hit on either side of him as he ran. They reached the first of the rocks. Most of the ambush party had been dispatched. The shambles of the enemy's formation only allowed for one single devastating volley into the charging Indians, killing many. Frankie's last memory was the clash of their lines smashing into the Americans, and the butt of the musket rifle sharply connecting with his temple.